Let me introduce our panel first of all. To my right is Governor Jim Edgar. He's, as you all know, he was governor of the state of Illinois from 91 to 99, but more importantly, he's currently a distinguished fellow with the Institute of Government and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois. He also served 10 years as the Secretary of State and for a shorter period of time as a member of the state House from East Central Illinois, I guess you would say. Next to Governor Edgar is Rich Miller, who is the publisher and writer of Capitol Fax, which is a daily or so must-read for anybody interested in Illinois politics. Yeah, close observer of Illinois politics for 20-plus years, syndicated columnist, new media pioneer, and State House institution. And then finally, on the far end here is Randy Blankenhorn, who is the executive director of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, or CMAP. He's an award-winning urban planner, spent many years working at IDOT before going to Chicago. Currently, he has the hardest job of anybody on the panel, I think, and that's implementing Metro Chicago's first comprehensive regional plan in more than 100 years. So good luck with that, Randy. Okay, well, we're here tonight to discuss this provocative topic that ASPA has posed to us, and that's the question of whether there are two states of Illinois. And this is a long discussed subject, goes back many decades, and from time to time pops up, especially among downstaters. I think it pops up quite often. And was recently broached by a couple of Central Illinois GOP House members who introduced a piece of legislation to separate Cook County into a different state in sort of a lighthearted moment in a period of time when they had nothing to do. They introduced that piece of legislation, and it's also was a subject of one of Rich's recent columns, and so I think that's what inspired the topic for this discussion, as I understand it. So what we're going to do is just have a little conversation among the panelists. We've got an hour. We'll spend sort of 45 minutes talking among ourselves, and then there'll be time for questions from the audience after that. So, okay. So first, let me pose a general question, and the question that came to my mind, especially when Norm called up and said he wanted to do something on this topic, and that is, are there really two Illinois? I mean, how would you describe this? I mean, a lot of people, especially downstaters, have this sort of idea in their mind what they think about that. But what do you guys think of? What's the basis of the split? Is it politics? Is it interest, culture, something in the water? What is it that makes these different regions?
I don't think that there are necessarily two Illinois. There's actually many different Illinois. I don't think this state has ever been has ever been a single cohesive unit. It's different. I mean, I think people in Chicago found out what Southern Illinoisans were really like when Glenn Pichard ran for governor, and it kind of freaked them out. But Southern Illinoisans are different than Central Illinoisans in many ways, and they're different than Northwestern Illinoisans, than suburbanites, than Chicagoans, and then people who live in Lincoln Park, who live on the south side or the west side. I think what I was trying to get at in a piece wasn't just that there's this strict divide between Cook County region and the rest of the state, but that the whole state appears from the outside to be almost ungovernable, that it's so diverse and so crazy and so at each other's throats so many times that it's just very difficult to do. He did it, but it wasn't easy. Quinn's trying to do it. He's making it look a lot harder than it has to be. But he didn't leave Cook County much. So if he stays in Cook County, it's a lot easier. But anyway, I think that was the point, that it's just so diverse and historically clashing. I have an ancestor who was in the Union Army, and his first assignment was to go to Southern Illinois to put down a rebellion. pretty much says it all right there.
I don't think there's two states. I think we have the traditional urban-rural tension. I think that's probably true in every state. Has a large city. I think there was a lot of variety, as Rich mentioned. There's as much a difference between somebody from Stevenson County in northwestern Illinois from somebody from Saline County around Harrisburg in southern Illinois is there between somebody in Springfield and the north side of Chicago. My experience of 18 years of statewide office and 4 statewide campaigns, there's just a lot of variety here. Now, there's no doubt there's some difference. Those people up north speak funny. But for the most part, I just think we have a lot of variety. And I would agree with what Rich said, that this state doesn't come together as a state very often. There's 2 times in my lifetime that I point to. The Great Flood in '93, we had people from Chicago jump in their car and for the first time in their life go south of I-80 to fill sandbags. The other, I think, is when the University of Illinois made the Final Four in basketball. You had people in Chicago really excited about the team from Champaign. And now those are small things and kind of fun. Those are the 2 that stick in my mind. This is a diverse state, but I think if there is a split, a big split, I think it's when it comes to politics. And it's not 2 states, it's 3 states. It's the city of Chicago, and really now Cook County. The suburbs have changed so much in the last 20 years. And there's the collar county, and the collar counties are now expanding to DeKalb and some of the, I think they call the donut counties at one time, and then downstate. And what's, I think, has caused a lot of concern in the last decade, and is kind of, I thought we were getting away from this them and us kind of attitude. But in the last 10 years, we've had one party control the state, and the people who control it in the Democratic Party are all from the city of Chicago, which, interesting, is the smallest of the 3. But because they are all from the city, I think they have a perspective that is oriented toward the city, and that causes frustration to people both in the suburbs and downstate. Traditionally, historically, we've usually had some balance. And I've always thought in this state, split government probably works better, but we haven't had that for a decade. And I think that has caused a lot of the frustration, particularly in downstate Illinois. Now, I agree with Rich. I think most people in the city, or maybe you mentioned, they don't even think about this as an issue. Now, they are confused. They think anything south of I-80 is southern Illinois. And my wife, Brenda, who is from real southern Illinois, was very indignant when people in Chicago area would say to her, "Oh, you live in Springfield, you live in southern Illinois." And that's not southern Illinois. She was insulted to be accused of southern Illinois was central Illinois. She thought those people in central Illinois weren't as good as people in southern Illinois. So again, I think we're very regional, but I don't think we're 2 states.
Yeah, I guess that I would say that it starts with, if there are 2 diverse kinds of activities going on, it really is it's a metro versus rural divide more than it is a Chicago versus downstate. And I think that's true across this country. Maybe unless you're Montana, you don't have a homogeneous state. You have cities, you have suburbs, you have rural areas. Does it make it easy to govern? I don't think it does, but I don't think it's impossible to govern. And I think the politics of late have gotten in the way. I agree with the governor that split democracy works better, and we don't have that right now. I would say that when the governor said there might be 3, I would say if we're going to go that direction, I would say there's actually 4. Because I would say that our I-74 types of communities, Rock Island, Peoria, Champaign, Peoria is much more like Joliet than it is like Springfield. Rockford is much more like Naperville than it is like Champaign-Urbana. And so I think there is this whole, how do you think about a state that has so much diversity, which in a lot of ways this diversity is a good thing. And we should play to the diversity that this state brings. But I don't think that we're all that different than most parts of the country.
Well, the other thing, though, there's another problem here with people ginning this up. And it has been part of the House and Senate Republican direct mail campaigns for the last at least 10, and probably a little bit more than that, to directly try to divide, to go at this issue over and over in voters' mailboxes. This guy, your opponent, is funded by Chicago, right? The Democrats, is a Chicago Democrat, is with the machine. Those people, they just want to give welfare and blah, 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 and they want to take away your guns, right? That's pretty much it. Hasn't worked all that well, but they really ginned it up. And I would take special exception to those two legislators who proposed this didn't do so as a lark. It was very serious to them. And they did it as a play to their own base in their own districts, which, by the way, is just down the road in Decatur. It's not some hillbilly Southern Illinois place. No offense to Mrs. Edgar.
I'll tell her you said it.
Tell her the no offense part, too. So it has been purposely ginned up. And although it's always been there, but they love to go to it.
I got to tell you, and I will not disagree. I mean, there are many times I think I've probably even, hard to believe, I might have said it once in a while. I never believed it until Rod Blagojevich. And I got to say, the governor, if there's anybody that needs to bring the state together, that's the role of the governor. Well, no matter where the governor's from. I mean, I remember when I had a Republican-controlled legislature, it only happened for 2 years. And I had to defend Chicago. I mean, Mayor Daley never gave me the credit for it, but I had to tell him, no, you can't. And the governor's got to be the force that is, I think, the equalizer. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, Rod Blagojevich, I just don't think had a clue or cared where downstate Illinois was. I mean, I think most Democrats, I've always thought they're smart enough from Chicago to know I need some votes from downstate, so I ought to at least act like I care. He never did, and that always amazed me. I think Pat Quinn is so worried about the next Democratic primary, and there aren't many Democratic votes in downstate, that he is, I've been surprised. I really thought he would kind of counteract what Blagojevich had done. I don't think he's done it as much as I'd hoped he would do it. And kind of put down some of that fear, I think. And I think there's some legitimacy to that fear. You look at some of the formulas, some of the things that have happened in the last decade. I mean, when Rod Blagojevich wanted to do away with 4-H, now that just blew my mind. I mean, that's an institution in downstate Illinois. It was like he just didn't give it another thought. That, I think, there is some legitimacy to this concern, but we need to deal with it because we are a diverse state, and that is part of the strength of this state. I mean, again, being governor of this state, you appreciate just how great a state this is because of our diversity, and we ought to play on that for the positive and not allow the negative to develop.
So do you think that the split or the lack of communication or the us versus them sort of mentality that you're talking about has been exacerbated by the sort of polarization of the parties and the homogenizing of the groups? So, you know, you'd have no more Republicans almost in Cook County, really almost, and you've got very few Democrats downstate, so the interests become sort of parallel with the parties.
Well, you still have Democrats downstate. The trouble is they don't count. I mean, and it's nothing. It's not anything real new, but there's no doubt the Speaker of the House and the Senate President are the powers in the legislature, and the rest of them are not as important, and they both are from the city, and that I think there's just you don't have that influence. And the Republicans, they don't need the Republicans. They very seldom talk to the Republicans or include them. So the suburban input and the downstate input, that, of course, the two Republican leaders in the legislature are not from downstate either. They're from the suburbs. And that, I think, is part of the problem. The downstate, even the suburbs, really don't have anyone that's really influential in the policy making.
Right.
And that's changed.
Vince
right?
DiMuzio was a giant, also an alumni of this fine institution. But when he died, I think the downstaters lost a huge voice in the Democratic Party in this state. And he's never been replaced. Nobody's really ever stepped up to replace him, mainly because you just couldn't replace a guy like that. They don't need them. They don't really even want them because they haven't really developed anybody to put in their leadership team that they will listen to on a regular basis on downstate issues. Now they have some people, like Madigan has, for instance, John Bradley, very bright man from as far deep south Illinois as you can get before you get to Kentucky. And very bright, he gets a lot of tasks assigned, very difficult tasks. He did the fracking bill this year. But when it comes down to strategizing, it's all Madigan and his people who have their own little circle, tiny circle.
So is the problem really not whether this is a Chicago versus downstate, but it's how we're leading in the legislature?
Well, yeah, I think, and the governor to some
And the
extent. Though the
governor.
governor,
Yeah,
unfortunately,
I
has not
agree.
been as much of a factor as he should be.
Right, I agree.
And that's part of the problem. But that's maybe the problem of the state, not so much the region. But yeah, no, I think if there is I don't think there's a division. I mean, I think the diversity is good.
Yeah.
I don't think, downstate, you got to make that choice early in life. Are you a Cub fan or a Cardinal fan? But that means a lot of downstaters are Cub fans. And so, again, I think the problem doesn't really exist except in the politics, and I think it's in the last 10 years it's been exacerbated. I don't think in the 90s it was much of a problem because we had a balance.
Right.
I mean, we always were able to I can remember one time in a meeting with the two Republicans who were from DuPage County, the same legislative district, which I think there should be a constitutional amendment against that, and the two Democratic leaders who were in the city of Chicago. I had to protect downstate. It was something on the school construction, and downstate was going to get hurt. And I explained to him that I was going to veto the bill. But there always was a balance.
Right.
And again, we just have not had that balance. And I think, I don't think you can write that into the Constitution that you got to have a balance like that. But I think it would be far better if we did have that balance.
Well, let's think though, even 3 elections ago, was it, that all on the statewide ballot, all of the Democratic candidates were from Cook County, and all of the Republican candidates were from DuPage County. And I think that's a little bit emblematic of the same problem.
Yeah.
It's where are we getting central Illinois and southern
Yeah.
Illinois? And I think Rick makes a good point. Where are those leaders, and how do we bring them to the table?
Let me, and I don't want to take anything. I think I was Secretary of State, and it's a great office, and it was a great stepping stone.
Right.
But we're talking about the governor and the two leaders, and those are the ones that make
Right.
policy. The others are somewhat irrelevant.
But they are those stepping stones to higher office.
Well,
Maybe,
you have Dan
maybe.
Ridgeford now. He's from Pontiac,
Right.
which to people down here might be northern Illinois, but to them it's central Illinois. There's a vacuum of leadership in Illinois that we've had it since 2003 when Rod Blagojevich was sworn in. And he was Chicago-centric. The current governor is Chicago-centric, and they didn't really concern themselves with anything outside of their little region, and that has created a lot of hurt feelings, and rightfully so in some cases, and a sort of a vacuum that gets filled in by this hatred, this rivalry. Right? Look, when Bill Brady lost last time, the Republicans really thought they had that one. I mean, Bill was like measuring for drapes. Like he was on his second measure before he cut. And he lost. And he won almost all the counties. And so you never stop hearing about how that damn one Cook County and a couple other downstaters, but Brady won 90-some counties, right? Counties don't vote.
Right.
It's not the United States Senate. It's not the counties don't vote, but it was something that they were just furious about it. And it's festered, I think, downstate, that they can't seem to win that prize. Now there's some racism there, I believe as well. It's not widespread necessarily, but it's there. Because when you talk Chicago and you're in downstate, too often, when people talk Chicago when they live in downstate, when they're bashing Chicago, they're not bashing, white people who live in Chicago for the most part. They're bashing black people who live in Chicago. So there is that, and you can't ignore that. So I'll just throw that out there right now and back to hell off.
I would say I never thought about the ratio as much. I guess I just thought about those Irishmen. That's who I always.
Careful.
Oh, that's the real. For you, that was the real
That
problem.
was the real, yeah.
Yeah. Well, what about somebody brought this up before, and I think this is something. If you take a look, if you step outside of the parochial look at the state of Illinois, every state virtually, other than maybe South Dakota and North Dakota, has this urban-rural issue, or they have regional splits. And look like a place like California. They've got this bi-urban or two urban center kind of split, and a bunch of other junk going on. But New York, very similar to Chicago. To Illinois in this respect. And sometimes some of those states they're dysfunctional in their own way, and maybe it's just a matter of being a big diverse state. That's where all these factions are going on. Is there something different about Illinois?
Well, I've often thought, is there another state? In New York's the closest I can come to. But I don't know that much about New York, but my sense is that in New York, the city doesn't have the political clout in the state compared to Chicago. And I think the Democratic Party, and I have to give them their due, in Illinois, they are very allied. Even though they don't like each other, they do work together. Maybe because their economic interests are intertwined. But I'm not sure in New York you have that. But the other dilemma, I think, for Massachusetts is similar. But they have a state capital in the big city. And that's in New York and Illinois don't. The state capital is off someplace far away. And the other maybe thing that makes us unique in Illinois, the other big cities. And when I came to Springfield after college, this was a big city. Brenda, I remember saying, I can't live there. She said, there's too many stoplights, and I said, there's 6 movie theaters. But we don't have that many big cities outside of Chicago, whereas a lot of states have other big cities. So maybe it's not all concentrated in that one. So that makes us a little unique in Illinois. But again, I give the Democratic Party in the city a lot of credit. They are able, even though they don't like each other a lot, to work together, particularly come election day. And I'm not sure in other states are as unified maybe as they are in Chicago.
How long ago did Jack Vandersick leave?
99,
99.
Something like
He used
that.
to be a professor here. I took some classes with him, and one of the things that I took away from the class, and it's been a very long time ago, so I'll probably screw this up, but it was about immigration streams, and they tend to go along the same latitude, according to his research. All right, so you move from east to west, as the country moved from east to west, they tended to follow along in the same latitudes, and like people stayed with like people. So you have to remember when this state, the northernmost part, like around Waukegan, is on the same latitude as Boston, Massachusetts. And Cairo, down in southern Illinois, is on the same latitude as Richmond, Virginia. Now, try imagining governing a state with Boston at one end and Richmond at the other. Okay? And then you kind of get an idea for how difficult and then a whole bunch of crazy weirdness in between. And you get a kind of an idea for how difficult this state is to govern. Because the people are quite similar as the streams move west. And so it makes it extraordinarily tough to hold this state together. And it makes it even tougher when you're not a very good leader to begin with. And we haven't had a very good leader in this state in quite a while. And so it's a lot of this is just plain and simple, a symptom of lousy freaking leadership in the governor's office.
Yeah, I guess I would tend to agree with that. I think there are many, many states that have this similar urban, rural, mid-sized city that manage it better than us. And when I talk to the young people on our staff, I tell them all the time, government is almost 100% about leadership. And when you find states that are working, you're finding good leadership. And whether they're from the central city or whether they're from an outstate part of the state, that leadership makes things work. And I think that's what Governor Edgar was able to do for 8 years, was to bring people together no matter where they were from. And that's how this state has to function.
Years. The first couple of years were rocky, as I recall.
I worked for him then, so I have to say that.
I had a little time convincing Madigan what his role was.
But you won.
Yeah.
It's the only person that ever beat Madigan was sitting right next to me.
Yeah, I had quadruple bypass surgery too.
Which was more difficult, yeah.
In the end?
You know, one of the things, and I was thinking on your metropolitan, one of the toughest pieces of legislation I was ever involved in, but I always thought was the RTA. Because that's the only metropolitan form of government we really have had in Illinois. And the sponsor was Bob Blair, and it cost him re-election. I mean, he had other traits that could cost him, but it was the RTA that cost him the re-election. And that was just between the suburbs and the city.
Right.
And you know, I think we've come a ways from there. We're still not where we need to be, but again, it goes back that I think if people felt like they had some say at the table, they'd be much more apt to go along and meet the other part of the state halfway. And again, I don't fault the Democrats. I mean, they've been able to win the elections. And, you know, I'm just jealous. I wish we'd have won that last governor's race, which I thought we were going to win. But, you know, that is something, until that occurs, I think we're going to continue to have this issue, which I think we all agree is not a valid issue.
Right.
But it's a result of this political kind of occurrence that's happened that really hasn't happened often in our state history.
And that really is, I think, Governor, the point, that whether it's now with downstate Illinois or in the past with the suburbs or whoever it might have been, it's about not feeling like you have a seat at the table. And until we can make that happen, we're at least going to have this conversation, whether it's real or not. And it's not healthy and it's not helpful, but I think that's where we're at.
Yeah. And the key to the RTA, why we ever can make it work, it takes a supermajority,
Right.
which guarantees that somebody from both sides has to be involved in the final solution.
Right.
So I'm not suggesting we change the requirement to pass legislation. It was tough enough to get a majority on the tough bills.
Worked pretty well in California when they did that, yeah.
But that, I think,
Well, and you know, there was legislation introduced this year to combine the RTA with my agency. So, you know, even now, we're still fighting these fights even inside of northeastern Illinois.
No, it's again, it's not unique to downstate versus Chicago. I said the suburbs, they're just as paranoid sometimes about the city, and vice versa. You know, it's just that, again, if we could some way constitute a government where everybody had some input,
Yeah.
and they were players, they weren't just kind of figureheads as we see today sometimes, then I think we would go a long way in maybe reassuring folks, and also making sure that when you do the school aid formula, everybody gets their fair share. When you do other formulas, that it's equal. I mean, it's not equal because some areas are better off than others. I mean, be very truthful. I always tell downstaters, you complain about you don't get much. The suburbs are who ought to complain. I mean, they're the ones who pay the most in taxes and get the least from the state.
And I think, and I've written several stories and blog posts and columns about this, is that downstate is a net tax eater. And downstaters don't tend to really understand that. There just isn't the people and the wealth in downstate that there is in the suburbs, which is a net tax contributor. Cook and Chicago are about even, they break about even. But y'all downstate, the ones that are always complaining about the welfare of people in Chicago, are actually the net tax eaters in the state. And that has to do with all the facilities that are here, the roads, because there's so much distance between towns, and the fact that there isn't the kind of wealth downstate that there is in the Chicago region. And most people refuse to believe that when I tell them, but the numbers are really clear. They're plain as day. And it's something that, when that last, constitutional or whatever it was that was introduced by those Lopes and Decatur, and I don't think they got it either, right? State government is really helping, trying as well as it can, I guess, people over there, much more so than it would help any suburban town.
One thing, Rich, that I think you bring up that concerns me, and in a background way, I was here in Springfield for decades. I lived in Petersburg, Illinois, right down the street. When I moved to Chicago, there were more people in my apartment building than there were in my town. And so it was a little culture shock for me. But having this been in central Illinois for decades, the big thing that concerns me right now, and I think the state needs to focus on when we're talking about this, is how are we going to create jobs in small metro and rural America? And that's, to me, where the state ought to be focusing its efforts. Job centers have become metro. And we've got to find a way to connect downstate into where jobs are being created, and how do we make that happen to the benefit of this state? And not just to the benefit of Chicago, but to the benefit of the state. That's where focus ought to really be.
Yeah, and I don't think, and because of the way the leadership is in this state, I don't think there's a willingness to learn from success stories. Go over to, anybody been to Quincy lately? It's really a thriving community. Edwardsville, except for these three people down front. Again, a thriving community. There are several pockets of communities downstate that are doing extraordinarily well, and yet those lessons aren't being shared with the rest of the state.
Right.
How is it that Quincy, which sits on a border, right on a border with another state, despite all the tax problems we have in Illinois, despite all the other problems we have in Illinois, can do consistently so well in the unemployment rate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? How is that? How do they do that? I don't know. I'm not a metropolitan planner, right? But we don't have anybody at the top who's willing to look at that and try to help other areas do that as well. And that's just another function of this Chicago-centric, a lack of curiosity about the rest of the state that we have here. And you're absolutely right. Downstate, I was born in Kankakee, but I lived on a farm outside Clifton, Illinois. Population 1,000. Okay, every time I go back there, there's another, something else is closed in that region. These little towns are dying off, and people can no longer live where they grew up, and it just sucks. I have a lot of friends in Clifton, which is about 75 miles south of Chicago, who drive to Chicago for work.
Yeah. So how do we connect that?
Way,
That's what we have to do. How do we connect those economies?
Well, I think Rich touched on it too. You've got to have the leadership has to be concerned. And again, I don't blame the two Democrats from Chicago to be mainly concerned about Chicago. I mean, that's legislators, though they have state before their name, they are mainly district oriented. Again, that's got to come from the governor's office, because that's the one office that's got to be for the whole state. And I just don't think we've seen that kind of concern in the last 10 years. And that, I think, is important. And again, if we had one of the Speaker or the Senate President was from someplace other than Chicago, we'd probably have a little more interest. Now, I have to say,
you'd have a different conversation.
When I had the two from DuPage County in the same district, I got a little tired of hearing about DuPage County. But again, that's why you need the mix as much as you can.
Well, do you think obviously the lack of leadership at the top is a problem for the last 10 years? But is that just idiosyncratic with these two governors that we had, or is there something in the system that we're working with that leads that? And I know it's hard to sort that out when you're talking about two individual people and some weird situations that allowed them to get elected for one reason or another. But is it possible for us, say in 2014, to elect a governor who can have a broader view?
I hope so. I'm too young to. When I came over to Springfield, Otto Kerner was on his way out. But I always remember hearing from people in Springfield, a lot of them who were Republicans, they liked Otto Kerner. He was part of the community. Now, you know, I think we make too much about does the governor live in the mansion, but there is a reason, particularly for a Chicago governor to spend some time in the mansion. It means they're down in state and they're taking part in the community. And so I don't think historically we've always had this problem. Even when we've had a Democratic governor, even though we Republicans might have campaigned about it, I don't think that was as much of a problem as we've seen in the last 10 years. Now, we've had scarce resources, and it seemed like, particularly with Governor Blagojevich, every time he was going to cut something downstate. Now, it might be back to Rich's, they got an overabundance of things, but, you know, it was...
Because when y'all were building things,
yeah.
you and Thompson, you
No,
were putting them in the Democratic
No,
districts.
we did. Yes, we did.
Oh, yeah.
We did. Hey, you ever seen that? You ever seen that in McCormick Place in Chicago?
Yeah.
That big thing? Okay.
There's that, but
Okay.
you can hardly put McCormick Place in Peatone. All right, but...
Okay. Anyway, I think, again, part of the frustration was when these budget cuts, he was going to cut state parks. Well, that's fine. State parks ought to take part of the cuts. They shouldn't take all the cuts. And state parks are something downstate. It's like the 4-H. There really wasn't any suggestion they were going to cut back on things that were going to Chicago. And again, I think that was part of the rub. Because I never really believed this was an issue, even though I might have said it in the campaign, until the last 10 years. And I think it has been something that I can see why downstaters get a little concerned. That doesn't mean we ought to split the state. I mean, that'd be a disaster. And as Rich said, downstate would suffer because we really do better off this system and people realize. But I think that appreciation of downstate from the leaders to be is something. Maybe it's just a perception, but you need that. That's what a lot of government's about, is perception in politics. And unfortunately, we haven't had that. You know, act like you care, even if you don't care. I think is what I think downstaters like to see.
There was a report on WSIL TV, I think it was that the governor hadn't been to Southern Illinois in months. And then all of a sudden he scheduled something for Southern Illinois like a week later, and then he canceled it because he scheduled it during the last 2 weeks of session. Well, of course he's not going to have time then because he's in Chicago.
Right.
Instead of Springfield.
Yeah.
But anyway, you're right, there's a perception, there's a reality as well. He didn't campaign much downstate in 2010. He doesn't really travel much downstate unless there's a flood or other kind of disaster. He flies to Springfield and back, and that's pretty much it.
Of course, one of the things politically that's happened, I mean, when I ran for governor in '90, downstate was swing. It was about 51-49. Today, it's at least 10. I mean, Topeka and Jim Ryan and Bill Brady all carried downstate well more than 10%. So it has changed. And I think, you know, politically, a Chicago Democrat, particularly who's worried about a primary, is going to probably not spend a whole lot of time in a campaign downstate. But again, you've got to remember, you're governor for the entire state, and you need to spend some time, and you need to show some interest and some concern. And I think historically, I do think past governors from the city of Chicago have shown more concern. I like to think, I spent a lot of time in Chicago. I actually had some people that used to think I lived in the suburbs. With my twang, they thought I lived in the suburbs because I was on the Bob Collins show all the time. But, you know, I made an effort to spend a lot of time in the city of Chicago. I didn't get many votes from the city of Chicago, but I spent time there. And
You did pretty well there. And then nobody's, in '94 you won Cook County,
yeah.
right? That has not been done since. Now, I don't want this to be constantly about, though, that the problem between the split in this state is all Chicago's fault. From a downstate perspective, it is. From a Chicago's perspective, it's what the heck are you people complaining about?
Yeah, it's not an issue.
All right, it's not solely. I think there's a perspective downstate that they're getting the short end of the stick. They might say something else about the end of the stick they're getting, but they're really not. They're holding up their own. It's still a decent place to live. I lived in Chicago. I was born in Kankakee. I choose to live downstate. I don't have to live here. I could go back to the city if I wanted. I choose to live here. it's a pleasant place to be. And there are too many people that just get so angry about everything. And it's unhealthy, and it's really wrong of political leaders to gin up that division for their own political benefit. And so when you have that, they need to be shouted down more. I think the media tended to just let them speak and not challenge them and not, point out the facts, the errors in their ways of their facts, and they just got away with it. And I don't think that they should be allowed to get away with it, because as many problems as we have in Illinois, we can't escape it. I mean, it's our state. We may not be one, but it's our state. We may hate each other, but we got to work together somehow. So people like that need to be really brought up.
Well, one thing that, I think that when we think about it, and maybe why I'm on this panel, is this really is a downstate concern. I don't think people from northeastern Illinois
Won't spend any time thinking about it.
well, and maybe the governor's right that we don't spend any time thinking about it, or most of our elected officials that are leaders up there don't spend any time thinking about it. But the fact that to a certain extent we are exporters of funds, it never really is an issue for us.
Well, you never had to talk to Pate Phillip then. He used to remind me every day about how DuPage County was paying for everything and not getting anything.
But I think
He didn't want anything.
Yeah. I don't know that.
Yeah, he did.
But I think the question that Chris asked about, is this about the two people that we've had, and I think it is a lot of that. Let's be honest. You could probably tell me, Rich, the governor's approval ratings in Chicago are not good.
No, but they're better than they are in Springfield.
Right, but they're not good.
I was just saying. That's pretty easy to. But they're I saw a poll taken for Emmanuel, and they're not good, but they're not horrid. Okay. Everywhere else they're horrid.
Right.
Because he comes out, statewide 23, 25, 27%, 28%. So, I mean, if they're 40% in Chicago, you can imagine what they are the rest of the place.
Do you find the suburbanites are less fearful of the city than they used to be?
I think they are, and I'm going to tell you that part of it is through really, in all honesty, Mayor Richard Daley putting together this Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, where he brought, we have 284 municipalities in northeastern Illinois, a lot of places, but he brought them together to talk about what can we agree on, and what we can't agree on, let's just not agree. But how can we work together, because they realized that they're one economic region, and that stealing jobs from Schaumburg to Chicago, although it still happens some, doesn't actually help much. And so I think that was helpful. I think that you're seeing a democratization of the suburbs. I mean, there are more Democratic suburban senators than there are Republican. And so you're seeing a change in party affiliation that is somewhat natural given the immigration to the suburbs. But I don't think there's this same city versus suburb that there used to be in the 80s, when really the coalition was suburban Chicago plus downstate against the city.
Well, that brings up, I think, one solution maybe to this statewide dilemma. Mayor Houston's sitting out there, but I think mayors, sometimes they don't get caught up maybe on the partisan rhetoric quite as much as the legislature does. And if the mayors could maybe do more together statewide, county board chairman, even though they are partisan, again, it's not as partisan as the legislature has become. That might be one avenue, because it's a dilemma, and I'm not sure how we get out of it with the current makeup. And I don't necessarily see the legislative makeup's not going to change. I mean, they drew a heck of a map.
Right.
That's why you have more Democrats in the suburbs, because of the way they drew the map. But
Donnie Trotter's state senate district goes from about 63rd Street in the city of Chicago to the northern border of Kankakee.
Yeah.
So if you know anything about that that's a long.
So
I drove that with him once. He's like, "This is the end." No, wait, 20 minutes. Oh, this is the end.
Yeah, well, this is what
It's a
happens when
long-
legislators pick their voters instead of the other way around.
Yeah, yeah. But
Which is-
again,
which is a topic for another
the
day.
mayor's,
For the next
mayor's,
topic?
my sense was the mayors are, you know, their problems, the problem of a mayor of Springfield, I would think, would be very similar to the problems of all the other mayors in the state, and probably even the mayor of Chicago.
Right.
And in some ways, so if there was a, you know,
Yeah.
that statewide, I think would be a very
And
effective.
the other thing too, though, is that the suburbs and the city, it was such a region in flux. You had white flight, corporate flight out to the suburbs, and you had people like Pate Phillip, political leaders in the suburbs, bashing the Chicago, bashing the schools as a hellhole, bottomless pit, and that rhetoric has toned down as the situation is toned down. There isn't so much of that panic flight anymore, or what, and the corporate flight's actually
Other way around.
It's coming back the other way. And you're seeing with retirees, or people whose children have graduated from
nesters.
school,
Yep.
empty nesters coming back to live in downtown Chicago, and really revitalizing the city by doing so.
Absolutely.
Well, let's take this opportunity in the last 10, 15 minutes to take some questions from the audience. Yes, sir, with your hand up.
Charlie,
Charlie.
is that a planted question? Charlie Wheeler.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you guys for your opinion on something that hasn't come up, but which to me seems a very integral factor in these changes that we've seen, and that's the demographic changes in the state of Illinois. And I know this is something that Governor Edgar has talked about. The fact of the matter is, if you excluded the growth in the Hispanic population from the census figures, Illinois would have lost population. That was the demographic that showed a growth in the 2010 census. And that growth has contributed to growth in the collar counties. So the reason why, as Rich said, the counties don't vote is the people aren't there the way they used to be. When the governor started in politics, the proportion of people who lived downstate compared to the suburbs was much different than it is today. And as the suburbs have grown, they've changed. Suburbs, south suburbs were once upon a time white bastions. Now they're pretty much minority. Same thing for some of the western suburbs. And so as I see it, and this is, as I say, something the governor's discussed in the past, unless the Republican Party can find a better way to relate to the new majorities in these areas, it's going to be very difficult for a Republican to win statewide or to win the governorship. And what would your take on that be?
Well, when we look at, and I think you're right, I mean, all of the growth in northeastern Illinois and the 7 counties of northeastern Illinois is attributable to Latino population. And yet only 3% increase in the city of Chicago. It's all suburban Latino growth. And as we look at our projections out 20 years, every bit of new growth that we have is going to be in Latino population. And so it is we have to think about this differently. And I agree with you that if Republicans can't reach this group, I don't know how they win statewide.
Right, and this rejection of the other has got to stop. And a lot of credit to Governor Edgar for trying to lead his party that way, and they don't always listen. But you were pushing legislation in Springfield earlier this year, touting Latino issues during the campaign last year. They don't necessarily listen, and it's all a game of addition, and too many people want to play Republican Party politics as a game of subtraction.
In Illinois, though, I will say I think we should give credit to the 2 Republican leaders in the legislature. Like the big test, the test in Illinois was on the driver's license for undocumented immigrants. The 2 Republican leaders not only voted for it, they showed up at the press conference and they were vocal. And I think inside the state, at least, and even Bill Brady, who is viewed as very conservative, he had a pretty good track record on
He voted for
immigration.
in-state tuition for
Yeah.
undocumented years ago.
I think our problem as a party, I think in the state we get it, at least the state elected officials. Some of the people from the state to go to Washington don't get it yet. And that could be, if the party, there's an opportunity in Washington on this immigration for the Republicans to try to not completely lose the Hispanic vote like we lost the African American vote. And if we do, as I've said many times, we're going to go the way of the Whigs. There's just not going to be enough people left. Now, we might be able to win in Idaho, but we're not going to win in Illinois. And part of the dilemma, though, is that in a primary, and that's where most of these people are elected now, since we don't have general elections that mean anything.
Right.
And in a primary, you get a small turnout, and they have a tendency to be the extremes. And we don't get too many Hispanics showing up in Republican primaries. And so you have these Republican candidates who know, if I can get by the primary, I'm elected. Now, that's not statewide, that's district-wide, but that, I think, is part of the dilemma. And that's what we've seen at the congressional level. Somebody pointed out, the way these districts are drawn, there are very few Hispanics in a lot of these Republican congressional districts because they're all in the other part of the state, so they have Democratic districts. That's a challenge. But I agree. I mean, we need to, as a party, we've got to go back to, there was a point when African Americans even were more Republican than Democrats. We had union members. I mean, the two parties weren't as separate as they are today. They overlapped in a lot of ways. It did give you a choice on election day, but it didn't mean that if you elected a Republican or Democrat, we're going to have a 180-degree switch in government. Today, unfortunately, I think we're more polarized, and the Republicans are losing on this polarization. And the Hispanics is the best example of that.
Yes, sir.
You touched on it a little bit, but it's embarrassing for me as a voting American to see the low turnouts that we get. How are you going to address it? It seems that's where the votes you need are. Those people who stay home and don't vote, they don't help anybody except when they write their editorials.
My guess is people who write their to the editorial page probably vote. Some of them I wish wouldn't, but either write or vote. But I think they vote in general. I think general election, I'm not as worried about that turnout. I think we get a turnout of, I want knowledgeable voters. I don't really want just everybody showing up if they haven't taken time to know what they're voting on. What worries me is the primaries. I think that's the really scary low turnouts. Of course, we don't help in Illinois. We have primaries usually in the dead of winter. When we had that one on February, the last gubernatorial primary was it February 2nd, Groundhog Day? Just so the Democrats, they hadn't changed it because of Obama. That was terrible. I wish
they changed it back because it was too much of a problem.
Yeah.
They had to put out all kinds of fires, and they thought, let's put it back.
Now, we ought to have it. We ought to have our primaries, I think, like most states, more in the summer.
Bite your tongue.
Huh?
I like the longer cycle. And
I don't like winter. I've campaigned in the winter.
I have to sell newsletters.
Yeah.
But I don't think it really shortens the cycle that much anyway. And the thing the turnout issue that really concerns me isn't so much state turnout. It's these local municipal turnouts. When you get 5%, 10%, 15% turnout in a local municipal election. And I really think, and the mayor of the city of Chicago will not like this, and a lot of other mayors won't like this, but I think those are so embarrassingly small that they need to be moved to either the off year or the presidential, something to get turnout up, increased turnout, because it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous how few people vote.
So I understand that thinking, but if you're a mayor, some of you here in this room, do the issues that you worry about at your city get lost in those elections?
Who the heck's listening to them anyway if you got a 10% voter turnout? You know what I'm saying?
But at least you're getting pressed for 3 months.
Yeah, and they like to control that, and that's one reason why they like the primary in March or February. They thought they did anyway because they could control the turnout better. They don't necessarily want
filing dates right at Christmas and nobody's paying attention,
right.
Except the incumbents. Yeah.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Would the Capitol care to comment on Illinois' corporate tax structure and the overt assault by our neighboring states' governors and even as far away as Texas to get our businesses? What can we do to keep our businesses here, and how can the corporate tax structure.
I think we've solved that with conceal and carry now, so. Perry shows up again, we'll get him head to head, right?
I don't think that requires a further answer.
You know, when I dealt with CEOs, you know, they didn't worry so much, they didn't worry about the corporate income tax. They shouldn't, it's not that big of a burden to them.
Most of them don't pay it.
Yeah, they worried about workers' comp. But what they really worried about was the overall health of the state. Because, you know, the quality of life in the state, I mean, the schools, because they wanted people coming out of the schools that they could have workers that could do the job. I'll never forget John Deere. About the end of my governorship, they came down one day to see me. And John Deere, to me, is one of the great corporate citizens we have in Illinois. I mean, without John Deere, I'm not sure the Quad Cities would still be there. But they're really good, I think. And they came down and they were talking to me about a golf course they were building. I don't play golf. I was bored to death listening to this discussion. And finally I said to him, why are you guys down here talking to me about a golf course? And they looked at me and they said, well, if we get this golf course built, we'll be able to get the PGA here and things like that. And I said, well, why do you care? He says, you know how hard it is to attract top quality people to come to live in the Quad Cities when they can go live in Chicago or LA or or other places or Denver? Said, we need to improve the quality of life in the Quad Cities. And this golf course, you'll have the PGA, they'll be able to play. It's just a big attraction. It's like getting, you know, a sports franchise. And it kind of clicked then to me that's that quality of life thing so those kind of things. Now the other things they tell me, we want a governor that we can call up and have a conversation. Now he might tell us no, but we want to have a chance to have the conversation and have the governor level with us. And I think they don't think the last 10 years they've had that. And I think that's part of why a lot of them are very frustrated. They look at the pension problem, they look at the unpaid bills, and they say, someday this is all going to blow up, and who's going to have to pay this? Are we going to have to pay this? It's that uncertainty, too. So I don't think it's so much the tax structure as it is, well, workers' comp and those things. And ever so often, I mean, Blagojevich used to always want to do these taxes he didn't want to tax any voters, he just wanted to tax businesses. And I think that scared him. But I really think, again, it goes back to that communication, that, you know, the state is moving ahead, and not just business areas, but in education and the quality of life, safe streets, and all these other things, transportation. And if they don't see leadership at the top, then I think they get very nervous that the future can be very unpredictable.
If you look, since the tax increase went into effect, and Wisconsin and Indiana and New Jersey and Texas and you name it, started to announce that they were going to poach our companies. Have you ever seen one announcement that they had poached one of our companies away? They haven't. The problem, though, is that when Caterpillar or Deere or whomever have expanded, they have not expanded in Illinois.
Right.
And we are losing a lot. And that's not because of the taxes, by the way. It's not because of the income tax. It's because of workers' comp. It's because of the quality of life. It's because of all sorts of other things. Workers' comp, man, the difference between workers' comp costs in Illinois and Indiana are just astounding. Where Indiana did, I take that back. They took one of the steel mills, it's like a small factory from Blue Island. They lured it across, and mainly because it could save hundreds and hundreds of thousands a year on workers' comp costs alone, right? And they were going to pay for the new place and everything. You just move, and it was Blue Island, the south side of Chicago, was within driving distance. So they had won, but it wasn't because of taxes. It's because of workers' comp.
Yeah, and I think the governor hit it right. When we talk to business leaders, which we do consistently, it is about the overall financial condition of the state. That's what they're concerned about. You know, there are things that make Illinois and attractive to business. We have a great workforce. We have great universities. We've got great technology. You know, there are things why Illinois is always going to be a draw for business. Their big concern is about what is that financial condition of the state.
I think we have time for one more, right? Yes, sir.
Do you think there can be real change
Yeah, I mean, I think we spend too much time complaining about Mike Madigan. He's a smart guy. He was the smartest guy today, and he's the smartest guy when I was here. He's a smart guy. He's preoccupied. I mean, that's all he thinks about. But no, I think if you elect a Republican governor, I think then we have a two-party state again. And then Madigan is important, but he's not the 800-pound gorilla. And anytime the speaker is the 800-pound gorilla, the state government doesn't work. It's just not structured that way. But I do get tired of everybody says the whole problem is Madigan. Madigan is part of the problem, but he can also be part of the solution. I mean, there were times when we had to do tough things that we could get Madigan on board, and I sure like to have him on board because he can count real good and he can come up with votes real good. But, you know, again, it's got to be that you got to meet halfway. But if you got rid of Mike Madigan, the state would not instantly improve. I'm not sure it'd get any better at all because there'd be a vacuum, first of all. I'm not sure who would even open the doors in the House. But
it'd be like after Stalin died, man. It'd be like for weeks. It'd be like, what do we do now?
Yeah. But again, it's I think it's because of failure of other parts of government that Madigan has assumed more power than really a speaker should have. But I don't blame him for that. There's a vacuum that he didn't cause, but he has definitely filled it.
Do you think, Governor, that we have consolidated so much power in leaders as opposed to rank and file members? Is that a concern?
Well, ever since
Because that's what we see as a concern.
ever since a community voting left. I mean, I used to work for the speaker under community voting, and trying to get the Republicans was definitely herding cats. Because, you got to remember, in a community voting, a legislator who had two legislators from their party from their district, their biggest enemy or their biggest fear was not the guy across the aisle, it was the other guy in their caucus. So it was just, there's much more independence. Now we've changed that. And there's no doubt the leaders have more power in the House than they used to. But, again, it's not just the leaders have the power in the House, it's the governor hasn't exerted the power the governor should exert. Illinois Constitution and statute, the Illinois governor is a very powerful office. I mean, it's one of the most powerful offices in the nation. It's the only governor I know that can rewrite legislation, the mandatory veto. It's a very powerful, now, one of the powers you have that I just soon not have was, I think it's about one of the few governors left that can actually decide whether a person lives or dies. And most of the other states, there's a review board. The governor just maybe can slow it down for a while. So the governor has broad powers, but the governor has to be able to execute those powers. And if the governor doesn't execute those powers, then it's going to create a vacuum, then you're going to have a Mike Madigan. Or even back when I started out, Russ Arrington. I mean, he was Otto Kerner's worst nightmare.
And Pate Phillip used to be, President No. I mean, he drove people crazy too. He drove you crazy.
Yeah. No, he drove me. But you could finally sit. Fortunately, you had Carter Hendren. You could sit down and you could get some things done. But again, I think people spend too much time blaming it all on Madigan. Now, I have to say, Madigan. When I had my quadruple bypass, I dedicated at least one of the bypasses to Madigan. I mean, he can be extremely difficult to deal with, but I think, we spend too much time blaming him for everything.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank the Springfield chapter of the ASPA and UIS for having us here tonight. I'd like to thank our panelists, Randy Blankenhorn, Rich Miller, and Jim Edgar. And with that, good night.